everyone. I'm going to be passing the microphone to Dr. April Natural to get us started. But before I do that, I'm actually going to pass the microphone to Gonzalo Celorio, who will be sharing just some few simple instructions about today in the training. So please stand by for that.
Hello, good morning, everyone. I want you to select your language on the bottom right corner. So the first thing is to select your language. If you select your language, you
Мову для того, щоб ви могли слухати або оригінал, або переклад, залежно від того, як вам.
please select your language. Have selected your language, you will be able to write on the chat in your own language, and it will be translated for everybody else in the language they had chosen. So if you write in Russian, people in the English channel will be able to translate that text into their language they selected. So once you've selected your language, you can read everybody else's messages in the language you selected. So just click on the message, and then the possibility of translating will appear, and it will translate it into the language of that you had selected. Back to you, Amy.
So much, Gonzalo. If you have any questions, please do not hesitate to post a question in the chat and it will be addressed. And now I'm going to just give a brief welcome to everybody. Thank you for joining us for this important conversation, and I will pass the floor to Dr. April Natural.
And welcome, everyone. Can you hear me? Great. Okay. So glad you are able to join us today for this important and timely webinar. And to all our speakers, we appreciate the time and the effort, and for everyone joining us. I want to start by saying thank you to the New York County Psychiatric Society for being a co-sponsor and working so quickly in supporting our effort. And this is something that's near and dear to many of our hearts, and certainly something that we think is pertinent for the time, but for those of you who are looking to help and may in fact be working with some of the folks who are suffering from the effects of the war in Ukraine. Vibrant's Crisis Emotional Care Team has also been working with the Afghan refugees who have come into the U.S. and are going through the process of having refugee status and settling here in the U.S. And so again, it is our privilege to be able to talk with everyone today, and we hope that the information here is going to be helpful. I know that it will be, and we'll also have opportunity for questions and answers later on. So let me move to introducing our team that we have here today. If we can go to the next slide, then, Gonzalo, thank you. Our agenda is that we will be talking about our trainers and then overall the crisis intervention strategy, as well, and as importantly, the most relevant cultural information to help when working with this population. We're going to talk too about what a typical deployment experience might look like, as we anticipate many of you are either in the field or may be in the field shortly. And then we'll wrap up with some self-care and then, as I said before, an opportunity for questions and answers. Thank you, Gonzalo. Next slide, please. My name is Dr. April Natural, and I'm the Assistant Vice President of Crisis and Wellness Programs at Vibrant Emotional Health. Health, again with our co-sponsor, the New York County Psychiatric Society, to put on this event. We're privileged today to have with us Dr. Alexander Dimitrovich. He's a lead consultant and a coordinator for mental health and social support in Eastern Europe, providing mental health support solutions, many trainings, and a good friend. Thank you for being with us here today. Alex, our hearts are with you, and we're so grateful that you're able to join us and glad that you're in a safe space right now. And we continue to wish the best for you and your family. With us, too, then, is Dr. Sander Koifman, who's the Chief Medical Officer at Athena Psychiatric. He's the co-chair of the Crisis Emotional Care Team's Advisory Committee here at Vibrant and one of our volunteers as well. And with us, too, is Dr. Craig Katz, the director at Mount Sinai's program in global mental health, one of the co-founders of Disaster Psychiatry Outreach, and also one of our privileged guests here joining us. Thank you so much, Craig. And Dr. Grant Brenner, the CEO and founding partner at Neighborhood Psychiatric and Wellness, another co-chair for the Crisis Emotional Care Advisory Team, and a CECT volunteer. These are folks who've been on the ground, who've been in the field, and as they will probably tell you, have some lived experience that we hope will be very informative here today. So let's go to the next slide. We thought we'd start by just taking a minute or two to be present with each other. These are difficult things to talk about. We're going to be asking people to kind of put aside what you may know from traditional mental health work and look at making this switch to how to work in an emergency situation. So let's start with a simple breathing exercise. Our colleagues at the National Center for Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder have told us that some of the more recent research tells us that it's the exhale that is even more important than a deep inhale. So I'm going to introduce what I call the 3-5-7 breathing exercise. And that starts with a normal breath in to the count of 3. 1, 2, 3. And hold it for the count of 5. 5, and then a long, full exhale to the count of 7. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. To empty your lungs, and it again allows you to take the next breath in, to hold it for 5, 3, and then a good long, full exhale to the count of 7, 5, 6, 7. And one last breath in to the count of 3. Hold it to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and a long exhale, getting the stress hormones out of our body and becoming fully present with each other here today. So, as we start with this important work, I'm going to turn things over to Dr. Craig Katz. Next slide, please, Gonzalo. To talk about crisis intervention and emergency work. Very important to understand the differentiation between this and traditional mental health therapy services. So I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Katz. Thank you for joining us today.
Craig, unfortunately, we cannot hear you on your microphone. I'm sorry. So can you just make sure I'll put you back as a speaker.
Okay, can you hear me now? Okay. All right. Well, what I said was so important, it's worth repeating. So here we go. What is disaster behavioral health, disaster mental health? Right, in a most basic sense, it is the application of what we know in mental health to the disaster setting, to the disaster affected community. And there are a number of aspects that go into disaster mental health, including thinking about the time frame in which you are responding, the sort of the acute period versus the long. And we think about the acute period, the days, weeks right after an event, the long term, the post-acute, months to years later. We're thinking about the Ukraine war right now, and it's super acute, of course. And when we think about the COVID-19, it's been acute, long, post-acute, acute, back and forth. So that time frame doesn't always work, but think about that nonetheless. Also think about what we call the disaster community, which is all the different people that are touched by an event. And disaster mental health is very sort of public health oriented, community oriented. So we're thinking about people that have been directly touched by the war. Of course, the people that are have been injured or lost loved ones, been displaced. We're of course thinking about the soldiers. We're thinking about the aid workers. Thinking about the government leaders who are important to think about too. So they're all different, and when you look at this visually, it's sort of rings of people that are more or less directly impacted. So disaster mental health tries to think about all those terms, and disaster mental health also, as I'll explain more in a moment, is also very much thinking about not so much about psychiatric pathology. It's really geared towards preventing psychiatric problems down the road. At least when we're thinking about the dealing in the acute aftermath. So next slide, please. So a very important concept, something that I've been talking about for a while, is sort of thinking about what your role as a mental health professional is, particularly in the acute disaster setting. Right now, right in the heart of the war, and particularly if you are on the ground. In a refugee camp or in an aid station or in a medical clinic, and that is sort of thinking about yourself as I would say, a person first, a health professional second, and a mental health professional third. And by that I mean we are not focusing on diagnosing people's psychiatric problems. Again, we're trying to prevent them. We are thinking about more about their various needs right now, and many of their needs, perhaps most of their needs, as things are happening, are going to be much more about basic needs, not about psychiatric diagnosis and needing necessarily psychiatric meds or psychotherapy. It's in all likelihood that is not what's needed. And so, if you are working in the field, what you want to be thinking about is what are people's most pressing needs. And there are going to be many in the acute period, many non-psychological approaches that are going to have psychological benefits, right? And that are just going to make people do well, feel better. Just to give a quick example of that, we, in responding to post-earthquake El Salvador many years ago, we showed up at a town that had been leveled by the earthquake, a rural town. A place looked like a bomb had been dropped on it. Looked like war to us, actually. And we showed up with our PTSD surveys and our medications. And what we found actually is the people were hungry. They didn't have food. Other aid agencies had not shown up yet, and but we had a bunch of mental health professionals from New York. But so what we did is we put away our surveys. We drove back into the capital and showed up the next day with a lot of food and sterno and things with which they could cook it. That's the way you kind of have to be thinking. And I would say, I don't want to discourage anybody from trying to help out help Ukraine right now. But if you're not able to think in those terms, you may not be best suited for working in the acute period right during when things are happening or in the field. Just want to be thinking about that. Okay, next slide, please. So, and in that respect, when we think about sort of the treatment framework for what we do, One way to think about it is something called psychological first aid, which I would kind of very roughly define. Of course, it's the analog of what we all know as medical first aid, but I would think of it as roughly the sort of the tending to the mental scratches and bruises that people are inevitably going to have because of what they're going through, the trauma, the grief, the loss, tending to them so that they don't become festering wounds, don't become psychiatric problems in the long run. That's what we're hoping to do. That is our aspiration. I have to say the science behind all this is still something that is lagging, but intuition and experience suggest that if we get in there early and provide something like psychological first aid, we're going to help people feel as better as they can under the circumstances, and that's a big caveat, under the circumstances, and prevent long-term problems. So psychological first aid is something we do in the immediate aftermath, the acute period, and it is appropriate for really anybody, survivors, witnesses, responders, military, and the idea is to bring down distress levels and foster adaptive functioning. That's what we want to do. And ideally prevent problems in the long term, but we want to make people feel better and do better as much as they can under the current circumstances. And what we, again, are not focusing on is thinking about psychiatric diagnosis and psychiatric treatment. And if you look at the next slide, you'll see what the elements of psychological first aid are. So you can see they're very, very kind of basic ideas. To some extent, I like to think of psychological first aid as just thinking psychologically, even if you're not acting psychologically. But thinking about the psychological impact you have from doing all these things. So the first item here is contact and engagement. And that may be an important part of psychological first aid because depending upon where you are, if you're working in the field, where in the field you're working, people may not be coming to you and saying, I need psychological help. You may need to figure out where you're going to plug in, who is in need of help. And again, it may be that you plug in someplace where you are handing out blankets, or you are registering people for a refugee camp. And doing all that, though, with your psychiatric ears on, talking with people, using that as a chance to have a psychologically informed conversation while you are dealing with their practical needs. So that's very important, depending upon the setup that you're in, sort of who are you going to be working with. And again, it may not be coming to you explicit, or coming to you at all, having explicit mental health distress. They have other needs. And then we want to be focusing on the basics, people's safety and comfort, right? That comes first, taking people out of harm's way to the extent that's possible within Ukraine, and certainly, hopefully, in the surrounding countries to which they are fleeing, keeping them safe and making them comfortable, making sure, right, people have the basics, like know where they're going to stay tonight, know where they're going to get their next meal, and know that it's going to be a safe place, or as safe as one can make it under the circumstances, depending upon where you are. Then we want to think about stabilization, and really this speaks to the idea of thinking about who is, people that may be more aggrieved, more distressed, more agitated, more anxious than, let's say, the norm or whatever's adaptive under the circumstances, and tending to them. And tending to them in the most, sometimes in the most basic ways, listening to them, paying attention to them. Sometimes we also will use basic meds like sleep meds or anti-anxiety meds, although some people will challenge us on the evidence base for that. I personally believe that having available some basic anti-anxiety and sleep meds is a very helpful thing. Then people need information. They need practical assistance. Where do I go next? Who do I talk to for this? And particularly, how do I connect with my loved ones? And that is the sixth box here, but probably as important as any of them is keeping people as together as they can under the circumstances, or knowing how they can get in touch or get information about their loved ones is enormous. Giving some people some basic psychoeducation, that's information on coping, explain to them things to be on the lookout for to make sure that their anxiety doesn't keep going or get worse, or keep an eye on their sleep disturbance. And then, of course, linking with services. Wherever you're working, being very familiar with all the different services that are potentially being available there or in the community, knowing that and linking people up with them is really essential part of our toolkit when we're doing psychological first aid. Next slide, please. And really, many of you may be familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I usually pair this this framework, remind us all about this, as really sort of the I would say kind of a conceptual basis for psychological first aid and how we should be thinking in an acute traumatic situation like the war, which is thinking about people's physical needs, physiologic needs, including, of course, tending to injuries, but also thinking about their food, water, etc., making sure people feel safe as they can be. Then love and belonging, that's the social support part, connecting people. Now, the top two are a little hard in the acute aftermath: esteem, tending to how people feel about themselves, and self-actualization, realizing your potential. But there is, that is something we hope to get to when the dust hopefully settles, sometimes really, really soon. But there are ways to help tend to people's self-esteem and sense of, what they can offer in, let's say, a refugee setting by involving people in different activities that are needed to keep let's say, the refugee setting going. Helping set up childcare, helping clean the place, helping organize the place, playing a leadership role. If some of the members of the refugee community are health professionals or even mental health professionals, and they are okay, involve them. Let them be as helpful as they can possibly be. It helps people to feel better, and it actually helps the people around them to feel better. Next slide, please. So that's Maslow and the psychological first aid. Another way to think about this, I'm just giving you a few different frameworks, is the sort of skills for psychological recovery. And again, this is like psychological first aid. The focus is on the first few weeks and months after or amid a disaster, such as the war. And again, it's appropriate for anybody. And what we want to do is provide skills or foster skills to manage and reduce ongoing distress and make sure that people are functioning as well as they can under the circumstances, given what they are going through. And also accepting that everyone reacts and responds differently to a trauma, and also has, of course,
І, звичайно, ці навички реагування дуже важливі. Ці навички... Ой, я перепрошую. Чи ми можемо повернутися? Нам треба наступний слайд. Так, будь ласка, оцей. Це ці навички, ви бачите, що тут іде накладання, але є ідея в тому, щоб у людей була інформація, і вони справлялися активно. Тобто, щоб була певна екстраполяція, відхід від цього психологічного дистресу, від цього обвинувачення. Треба розробляти у них оці навички, як справлятися, для того, щоб вони були задіяні в якісь спільні заходи.
People, not pathologizing people's reactions. People are going to be upset, and they should be under the circumstances. How could they not be? We don't want to pathologize, but we do want to, at the very least, be an empathic ear for people who are in distress, and also be listening when we think people maybe their emotional reactions are getting in the way for them of processing information they need to process, of doing the things that they need to do. We want to be paying attention to that. So in that sense, we want to promote helpful thinking, not unhelpful thinking, wherever possible. And again, we want to rebuild social connections and make sure people, we don't want people to feel or be isolated as much as possible under the circumstances. And that might be, trying to, for planners, having people from the same community together, even if some of the families have now been fragmented because, let's say, the men have stayed behind. But we want to try to keep villages, communities, buildings together. I mean, that would be enormous if that's possible. And as mental health professionals, we can certainly counsel planners and government folks that would be a very important thing, a very good thing. I mean, everyone knows that would be a good thing, but how good and important that is for people's mental health. Next slide, please. Basic ideas. So a bunch of disaster mental health experts got together a number of years ago now. I think it's a while ago now. And they said, okay, what are we going to do? How can we create a framework that is as evidence informed as possible, because in the end, it is very hard to do really good, solid, double-blind, placebo-controlled research in these settings like war or other, acute periods around a disaster. But what do we know from experience, and what can we extrapolate from the literature to give people a broad framework? And these are the 5 principles, strategies that they came up with. And that I always tell people, if you don't remember anything from what I have to say, just try to remember these 5 things. They are the strategies that we should be aspiring to, right? So you'll see that they have overlap with psychological first aid, but it's briefer, it's just 5 points. So 1 is promoting a sense of safety. 2 is promoting calming. 3 is promoting self and community efficacy. And again, that's the sort of the empowerment, esteem idea that I talked about. 4 is social connectedness, right? The social support. And 5 is hope, in which say realistic hope. We want to promote that as much as possible. Focus on the true and real positives, even when the negatives seem so overwhelming. So these are strategies. The details of how you would do this in any given setting with any given individual or community will vary. But these are the 5 basic principles I would keep in mind. And if you use these as sort of your lodestars, your guiding star, you're going to be doing a great job as a mental health professional and as a person during the acute impact of the war. Okay, next slide. So to think a bit about specifically now about war and the psychological effects. Well, right, of course, the effects are complex and multi-layered, and it's talk about, I mentioned the disaster community earlier. War affects everybody, right? It is all encompassing, and it not only affects the individuals, it affects the environment. It destroys the lived environment, and so it is as disasters go, it is. One doesn't want to demean other disaster types, right? But war and combat is just so intensely devastating and uniquely devastating that certainly anyone who's trying to help has a lot of work to do, and that includes mental health professionals. So looking at the next slide, which actually breaks out these effects into some detail. The slide says psychological effects of war, but it is actually the multidimensional effects of war. And you can see, of course, the physical ones. And I read a great article recently that really spelled this out quite well. But right, the physical, impacts on nutrition, and of course, there are injuries and nutrition, and the impacts on even existing non-communicable diseases like high blood pressure and diabetes, for example, where people may not have access to their medications, and of course the potential for infectious diseases, and we got to be thinking about COVID-19 right now, and of course the injuries, physical trauma. So that's all the potential physical effects. It's so important to keep all those in mind, right? Because I think it was Freud himself who said the ego is first and foremost a bodily ego, right? So as our bodies go, very much so goes our brains and our minds. And I think the same could be said for our physical environment. I don't think I need this audience of mental health professionals to go into all the psychological impacts. There are many. We think about PTSD. Usually, though, when I think about mass trauma, or trauma in general, the sort of the big 3 that I think of are PTSD, major depression, and at least recurrent alcohol use. Those tend to be the big 3. But you also, depending upon the population, may see various forms of anxiety, clinical anxiety, that is, excessive anxiety, and medically unexplained symptoms, which is why it's often good if you are in a setting where you're playing a role in sort of setting things up, or you want to position yourself well in the field. Often pairing up with the medical first aid group, if there is one, is a very good practice. Because they will be seeing things that may not be able to treat, unexplained headaches, stomach stuff, etc. And you can hopefully be helpful. The social impact, is pretty straightforward, unfortunately, devastatingly straightforward. Displacement, food insecurity, financial insecurity, community breakdown. Just breakdown of the entire social fabric, as we're seeing if you're in the field, or as I'm seeing, watching all this in the news, just seeing a society disintegrate before your eyes, at least physically, some sense, maybe getting more unified psychologically. And then, of course, the ecological impact on the environment, the destruction of home and house, and making environments uninhabitable, even if somebody survives a bombing, etc. So it is like the whole world for somebody is, blasted apart, torn apart, disrupted, and made terrifying at the same time. It is so many things wrong with war and so many psychological impacts that we can and should be thinking about. Next slide, please. And just want to think a little bit about the human stress response, right? There are many things that our body does that are hardwired into us in our fight or flight response, which, right, the refugees right now very much are in sort of fight or flight to save their lives, right? And it's a primitive part of our brain, and it does all these things, the fight or flight response in our body, to enable us to be focused on survival, whether it's getting blood out there to our body with oxygen more, slowing down our GI system so we're not focused on eating, but getting whatever energy we have to our muscles more, and taking big deep breaths to get as much oxygen into us so we can do what we need to do, and big wide eyes so we can be not hyper vigilant but vigilant under the circumstances. So what we as mental health professionals want to do is certainly is not we don't want to get in the way of Mother Nature and the importance of this, but what we do want to do is make sure that that people aren't still having this stress response when they no longer need to do it, right? If somebody is relatively safe in a neighboring country from Ukraine right now, and their heart's still racing, and there's almost having like panic-like reactions, obviously that is not good. If they're not eating, that is not good. These are things that we want to be addressing as best as we can, and what we want to do is sort of bearing down people's stress hormones, if they're not necessary, if they're not adaptive at the moment, if they've now fled and they've landed sort of someplace that we believe is safe, that all government officials think is safe, and we want to encourage them to feel the safety in their minds and physically. And if we're not able to do this as well, of course, we worry about the ongoing stress response effect on people's pre-existing medical problems, or in the long term causing medical problems they didn't have before, diabetes, for example, and of course spilling over, particularly if you leave the adrenaline running for too long, into things like PTSD, right? So our job is to be grateful that people have the stress response to get them into the fight or flight mode, but make sure that people are not in fight or flight mode when they no longer need to be. And I think that concludes my presentation. I believe I'm going to be turning it over to Alex now.
Hi, Alex. Unfortunately, we cannot hear you. So if you could please make sure your microphone is turned on, that would be really helpful. Thank you. Sorry for the interruption. Hi all. As we sort out this technical issue, we did see that there was a question for Dr. Katz, and so I'm going to just have him address it while we can. The question is, what's the latest evidence or guidance on the use of propranolol after acute trauma to reduce the chances of developing PTSD? Craig, I'll make you a speaker.
Thanks, Amy. Yeah, I just saw the question and was typing an answer. Propranolol is theoretically very promising because, right, it would block the norepinephrine, the adrenaline response. But so far, from all I've seen in the research, it hasn't been borne out. It seemed to work in some non-clinical samples when you studied sort of normal subjects, but using it in recently traumatized individuals, it has not borne out as what would have been hopefully been like the sublingual nitroglycerin of psychiatry. So it is certainly not the standard of practice. Maybe one day we will find out how to use that or modulate the norepinephrine system better, at least more directly. Instead, we have to do it with more of our psychotherapeutic principles, which is okay too. I think with that, if Alex, hopefully that answers your question. If Alex is ready, I will turn it back over to him.
Okay, we are still working on Alex's microphone, so in the meantime, I'm going to turn this to Dr. Koifman, and he'll begin this section, and as soon as Alex's mic is confirmed, we'll pass it back to him. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. So this is a section we were really hoping for Alex to speak to. My apologies for having to step in, but I'll do the best I can under the circumstances. We really wanted to focus on the general principles of cultural competency and also basic cultural humility. The importance of understanding of person's experience, but also framing it in a very separate bucket. When we think about the individual experience and historical experience, unfortunately, and especially in this conflict, this has become a significant issue where some are trying to justify current actions based on old prior history, and aware of the potency and fallacy of doing something like that. So as much as we comment on some of the overall understandings that can benefit one as a provider, as a clinician, as a human being supporting another person in distress, we also want to be very thoughtful and careful about separating history and individual experience. And I'm happy to be interrupted.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, that's good. Dear ladies and gentlemen, I'm so sorry for this technical issue, which I faced. First of all, I would like to thank you all for inviting me to this event. I would like to say that due to some technical reasons and limitations, almost 375 colleagues from Ukraine were not able to join today, but hopefully there's going to be a recording which I'll be happy to distribute among my colleagues. So that's a brief introduction in English. However, I will switch into Russian in this case, just because I understand that my colleagues from around the world will see that, and I want to support them a little bit. In this case, in Russian, because it's more widely spread. With all my respect to Ukrainian language. Еще раз добрый вечер. Я надеюсь, что сейчас пойдет перевод. Я так понимаю, что...
And perhaps in order to talk about the situation which came up today and how we can support people, our nation, we need to talk about cultural aspects. I think the fact that I started in English and also I can speak perfect Ukrainian, but the fact that now I'm speaking Russian shows the versatility of cultures within Ukraine. So, in order to talk about first mental health aid and the crisis response, we need to consider the cultural peculiarities. So I've been working in the sphere of crisis response since 2010, and I could have never thought that the topic of the first mental health aid and crisis response would soon be needed to so many people from my country. Since 2014, since the conflict broke up in Ukraine after the annexation of Crimea and the separation of Donbass, me and the colleagues, we have adapted the existing materials, and I appreciate April's support. We've met around that period, and the methodology provided by the US colleagues, it has been slightly adapted considering the mentality, the peculiarities of Ukraine. I want to say the following. Just a second, let me deal with the slides. I want to say the following. So the level of traumatization depends on our perception of the world. There is this classical point. It's not the event which causes the physiological response and emotions, but the way we interpret what is happening in this event. And even during war, this point is effective. I can say that it's important to understand that under my contract I had to leave Ukraine in the first hours of bombardment. So I am in safety now. I work from Europe. And I have quite a long experience, but I can see from me and from the colleagues, I can see what is happening to those who is in safety. We have to understand that the events which are unfolding in Ukraine,
Тех, кто находится внутри страны, это представители, это бойцы, которые защищают, так сказать, страну, находятся на передовой, это гражданское население. В тех ситуациях, где это возможно, необходимо учитывать и проводить фильтр, будем так говорить, потенциального травматического воздействия. То есть, конечно же, он будет разниться в зависимости от того, мы говорим о людях, к примеру, которые находятся... Я вижу в чате, что нет перевода на английский язык. Пожалуйста, уточните. Если нет перевода на английский язык, то я повторю все быстро на английском. Дайте, пожалуйста, кто-то знать.
Is there a translation into English? Please let us know. Sander, can you hear me? There is no translation into English?
about the connection difficulties, and I'm going to continue in English. But some of you may notice that I can also continue in Russian. And that's really speaking right back to what Alex was pointing out. And even though I'm a Soviet expat, my family is from Moldova, but also from Ukraine. And that's a common story for those that are living through this awful war. That so many of us have shared roots and shared histories, and stepping back and thinking about who is experiencing most distress in the moment. And I think for us as providers, for us as clinicians, it's taking that moment and thinking about the person in front of you and their personal experience. So as we think about potential populations, we talked about the civilians and the military in Ukraine, those who have emigrated or had to move due to their contractual and professional obligations, refugees and immigrants post-invasion, second and third generation Ukrainian immigrants, non-Ukrainian loved ones and friends. And increasingly, we're hearing about the Russians that in protest or in fear have escaped Russia in the shadow of this war, as well as first and second and third generation immigrants from varied backgrounds. So the community that we may be incredibly diverse, and individuals' experiences will guide the interaction, will guide the care, will guide the support. And that's, as providers, we would want to be very thoughtful about and understand the uniqueness of each individual experience. What we do also want to understand and appreciate is having some basic background of what are the everyday social norms, and what are the ongoing and durable cultural institutions that can help people preserve their identity. And this is going to become even a greater issue as we think about the children that may lose one or two parents, maybe in foster care. How do we really deliberately and thoughtfully address the continuity of culture for these kids or for the individuals that may be settling all over the world at this point in time? So gaining general understanding and appreciation of Ukrainian cultural institutions and offering that as an important resource of connection, but also understanding the cross-cultural needs that may be experienced even by the same individual. So, for example, there is an appreciable and large Jewish community that had a lot of American expats providing care and services for other members of the Jewish community in Ukraine. So that's multiple layers of involvement, and we really want to be guided by the history and the individual experience. Cultural competences are absolutely essential in not only understanding but also improving standards of care. So calling out in your local community that you may need to focus on cultural continuity, for example, if that doesn't exist, is also something that falls in the responsibility of us as disaster mental health providers. Having capacity to provide care that acknowledges, respects, and integrates individual cultural values is part of the essential, basic, well thought out clinical care and should be promoted as such. And of course, understanding of cultural context goes beyond race and ethnicity markers. Many of us may have heard the story of a young child that had to travel across Ukraine on his own in the midst of the conflict. And of course, he had cultural background that would be unusual even for Ukraine, being of Syrian and Ukrainian descent. So really being thoughtful and careful in the language we use and the cultural references that may be our references as caregivers may not coincide with the cultural references of the individual in front of us. So how do we address this? How do we do this thoughtfully? How do we do this consistently? First of all, listen. Listen, listen, listen. Listen more than talk. Hear and ask questions with full positive intent. Apologize as many times as you need to if you don't understand certain nuance, and listen to the responses and be guided by those responses. Understand what is the driver, understand what is the worry. Despite the setting of the war, the issues that may be worrying the person may be quite different. They may be struggling to reconnect to the family members. They may be dealing with housing issues. They may be concerned about the school for the children. All of those are important and valid experiences, and we want to really pay attention and listen to the concerns of the individual. Understand the prior experience of the individual, because a lot of ability to cope may be informed by our prior experience, but also by our prior trauma. So one of the important issues that is coming up, I'm working with a group that is focused on evacuation of individuals from Ukraine. And of course, people who are leaving, people who can leave, women, children, and the elderly. For a lot of women, the issue of safety, the issue of sexual harassment by those that may be controlling the movement is a very, very important and so really addressing that deliberately and purpose forces that you have to offer to provide for safety, and informing the individual how to address that safety even when they may have left Ukraine can be an important aspect of the conversation. Be open, understand that the hurt that the individual may have experienced may change their worldview. Not our job to try to change that. Our job is to be there and be supportive and try to get the person to be grounded and focusing on their current needs. And of course, the grounding principle is a respect of the structures that exist. Even though when you want to understand who typically makes decisions in your family, right now family may have shrunk to just 2 or 3 individuals. So who takes on that role of decision makers does not need to correlate to what we think is right. It only matters what has worked for this family group. If they need to seek advice from someone, it can be a family friend, it can be a newly acquired source of information. So we want to support that. And also really understanding what is the person's impression, what would be helpful. It's on us as experienced providers to guide a little bit of that, but also if we disagree, if it doesn't coincide with our cultural or religious preferences and frames of reference, it does not make it any less important, any less valid for the person in front of us. And we are on the what to expect slide. I think that goes to the next speaker.
Hi, thanks everyone for joining. I guess the technical difficulties, we might imagine that they're our sort of first lesson in crisis and disaster response, and the recording will be available later along with the slides. But one of the first things to expect is to expect the unexpected. And we also say that every disaster is different. Though some of the principles are the same, every situation that you encounter will be challenging and require some originality, spontaneity, as well as staying grounded in the basic principles we're talking about. So I got involved in disaster response in 2000. I actually saw Dr. Katz, gave grand rounds at Mount Sinai about the work in Ecuador he referenced, and I volunteered shortly thereafter, and then 9/11 happened. And since then, we've done responses, and sometimes I've worked with Sander more recently as well in Louisiana after Katrina. I traveled to Southeast Asia. We've done distance learning work. And most recently, as April Natural mentioned, we have been working with Afghan refugees. So Sandra and I flew into a refugee camp, and we arrived there not quite knowing what to expect, but knowing someone wanted disaster behavioral health expertise there. And we were quickly pulled into a meeting where we got up to speed really fast by listening and identifying as best as we could on the fly what was happening. So, a lot of what to expect is that you may enter a dynamic environment without having a lot of background information, especially if you're in one of the earlier groups. Later on, we are able to collect and provide more information for volunteers, and then there's more specific background. Thanks for advancing the slide there. So, in the United States, and if you're in other areas, you'll look for what the structure is. We use something called incident command structure, which is essentially a first responder model, and that means that there's a clear organizational hierarchy. And what you want to do is find who is in charge, and let them know that you're there, and make yourself available, and also stay out of the way a little bit so that you don't become sort of someone who's using their resources. It requires very careful paying attention to what's going on and waiting for the right time and maintaining a presence until that time. It's also important not to jump to conclusions too quickly, in the sense that there may be some situations where there's more than one leader. There may be multiple organizations involved on the site. And so it takes a little while to learn who is in charge of what. And so it's important to reserve judgment and exercise caution there. The key thing is to work out who is in charge, tie yourself to them in an appropriate way, offer whatever you can. As Dr. Katz was saying, a lot of times it's really very different from what we're used to in hospital, clinic, or private practice settings, and to maintain contact with with usually Amy is going to be organizing the response with April, back at sort of home base. So that's to check in with the volunteer team every day. That's very important for self-care, so that we don't get caught up in the work in a way which becomes problematic emotionally for us. Along those lines, collaboration is the name of the game. Disaster environments usually have many, many different organizations, governmental organizations, multiple volunteer groups, NGOs, sometimes spontaneous volunteers, and it's important to keep the main mission in mind. Like, what are we all there to do, rather than getting into any kind of confrontational situation. We want to work as effectively as we can with whoever is there, so it really requires humanity and humility. The support group that we have among our own volunteers is important. We as much as possible, never work alone. We always have a buddy who we check in with regularly. It's very important because the emotional reactions during a disaster can be very strong. The countertransference, to use the psychoanalytic term, can be quite powerful. It can be very sad, it can be exhilarating, it can be confusing, it can be distressing, and it's very important to have another person to help balance one another out. And likewise, it's very important to support each other, to be a mentor for oneself and others. So when Sandra and I were working together, this was really apparent to me, as Sandra would often give me important pointers and good advice, and I hope vice versa. Particularly, when the brain, is under stress, it's very easy to miss important things. And so adopting an attitude that's a growth mindset based in curiosity and as much as possible rational optimism is important. Rather than sort of looking for flaws, it's really looking for things that are going to work. And that's flexibility is required for resilience. I think I double clicked. So in terms of the basic assessment, this is a bit like triaging. Imagine you're entering a situation, you've never been to a place like this before. There's tons of people and organizations around. The first thing you do is take your own pulse. What am I feeling? What are my responses like? Do I have any particular reactions that I think will get in the way, and what will be helping me? And then remembering the basic training. Adopting a stance of humanity or compassion, taking multiple perspectives, listening, as we said, and seeing it from the other person's perspective, and really recognizing, especially when we are guests and when we don't have the cultural competency, that we have to expect that we're going to get things wrong. And as Sandra said, as Dr. Koifman said, be ready to apologize, be ready to course correct. Okay, once you've grounded yourself there, then you can start to assess what the needs are. And it's very important to listen and get the whole story. A lot of times you may be potentially in a rush to get information, but it's not like a detailed history the way you might take in a clinical setting. It's often much more conversational, and then later on you can get down to some of the nitty gritty. If someone looks distressed, it's important to have an area where you can take them where they can speak freely. So would you like to take a walk with me? Or often we'll establish an area where you can have a private conversation, and then they can tell you if they're having more significant problems. And of course, we use our basic psychological first aid skills, which are much more similar to a supportive approach than an uncovering or insight-oriented approach. We don't typically try to do any kind of intervention beyond psychological first aid and support, but if people need additional services, we will try to refer them to whatever resources are available, or try to identify resources if they're not available. Many times they're not going to be available, or especially with displaced persons, they'll be moving to a different location. It's hard to maintain continuity, so you don't want to engage too much with someone if they're not going to be able to sustain a relationship with you. That can be quite difficult. In the Afghan refugee village, I remember speaking with an individual who was quite distressed, and I wasn't able to offer him as much as I would like, but I did refer him to the mental health services that were on site. Okay, so we've covered active listening, but it bears repeating. Want to make sure first that you understand what you're hearing, and that can require a couple of tries. I've learned the hard way. Remain respectful, non-judgmental, and establish trust. It's important that people know that you care before they care what you know, and you can establish trust by maintaining a supportive presence, by listening, and by providing good information. For example, not giving answers when you don't know the answer, which we'll talk about in the next slide. Giving people room emotionally, which also requires tracking your own emotional responses, and paying attention to the subtext. So cross-culturally, this can often be more challenging. That's why it's important to listen and understand, but also look for nonverbal behavior, use the information that you've learned about what's happening, and do your best to realize there may be more subtleties than are evident on the surface. This goes along with not jumping to conclusions. Okay, finally, we can talk more about risk communication at another point. People can get resources for this, but we want to cover this very, sort of very briefly. Crisis and emergency risk communication is based on the psychology of how people communicate when under stress. And so it's based in trust and credibility, being ready to answer very difficult questions. A lot of times we'll think about what are the top 50 things that I could get asked, and come up ahead of time with answers to those questions. Staying on message, though people will often, ask other things that are very important, and learning the skills to address their concerns and come back to the message. Recognize and acknowledge that there's uncertainty. I wish I could tell you more, but we don't know right now. However, as soon as updates are available, we will be sure to let you know via, and here's how you get information. In some refugee villages, QR codes were put up and information posts where people could access up-to-date information, and making sure that your facts are right, and certainly trying not to spread disinformation. And so without going into too much detail, like I said, you can find CERC materials online, or we can share it with you. There's a few ideas here. So one of them, these are called templates by the Center for Risk Communication. One of them is the 2793 rule. So messages are no longer than 27 words delivered over the course of 9 seconds that contain no more than 3 ideas. That's kind of what the mind under stress can handle best. Another principle is 3 P's to 1 N. So we tend normally to look for the negatives, and under stress, that tendency is amplified, it's enhanced. And so when you're presenting information, try to present 3 positive pieces of information to balance out each one negative. And then maybe the most important one is the IDK template, which means I don't know. So if someone asks a question you don't know the answer to, it's very perfectly fine, very good to say, I don't know, and I understand why that's a concern, and here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to check, I'll let leadership know, we'll make sure that we get information about this when it becomes available. And the final thing I'd like to say about risk communication is don't talk to the media. If there is media there and they do want to talk to someone, make sure that you, unless you're the designated media contact, refer it, back to headquarters to see who should be the right contact for that. It's very important to manage those types of interactions so that we get the best information out to people, so that we can help them effectively. And I think that's it for me. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. Oh my goodness, a lot of information. And we have a few more things to go over. I just want to see, there were a couple of questions in the box that were being answered. So I'm going to move forward to starting to wrap up and talk a little bit more about what to expect in terms of taking care of yourselves as well. But let's go with the wrap up. There are a few comments I wanted to make after Dr. Koifman spoke about cultural competency, and not to insult anybody on the call, but we in the U.S. tend to not do a very good job about cultural literacy because we think we do a good job about it. But there are so many different pieces to each different culture, whether it's a family group, whether it's a business, whether it's part of a country, a city, a town, a school. There's so much to know about how people feel and perceive themselves as part of what cultures, large and small, that it's very difficult to know everything. So I love the reference to being ready to apologize. One of my toughest deployments was being sent in a matter of 2 days out to Dubai to debrief 27 Muslim men who had been in a terrorist attack and lost a number of their colleagues. And I had time on the plane to look for some information and to get caught up and with my lead to speak to them. But I knew that I was going to insult these people. In addition to saying, wait, white, female, Judeo-Christian person, why are you asking me to do this to begin with? But, it's who knows how to do this work and who's available. And so it was the first thing that I did was I said, I have not had enough time to learn about your culture, and I must apologize ahead of time. I know I will insult you. And anything that you can tell me to help me with this will be really, really useful. And every single one of those men, when they came up to introduce themselves to me, one to one, told me something about their culture. And what I took, and throughout the month that I was there working intensively with them, what I took away from it was another sense that we are in control of this, which is a little bit, again, a problem on our part, because every one of these folks that I was working with met me halfway in meeting the cultural barriers between us. And so bringing the cultural leaders, formal and formal, into your learning is empowering to them, but it also is much more informative. So we have to be as open-minded about learning about culture and increasing our cultural literacy in every group that we work with. I think there's probably nothing more important. But also I wanted to say about the Ukrainian culture, and I'm not from Ukraine myself, but I've been working there since 2015, training military psychologists. The war has been actually going on in the Donbass region for quite a number of years now. So this exacerbation to the rest of the country is devastating. But there has been an ongoing war that many Ukrainians have been fighting for a very long time, and working to address the behavioral health responses to that, because almost all of the soldiers who are in any way captured by the Russians have been tortured. So there's been a lot of intensive mental health work to do there. But the one takeaway, or the couple of takeaways, are that the Ukrainian people have a hard-won democracy. And as you can see from our media, they are not going to let this go so easily. And they want the tools to help them to do whatever they need to do, both psychologically, physically, and socially. So I think, as I think Dr. Brenner was saying, that there's a large span of things that we can do to help. And as you heard Dr. Katz started us off with, is a lot of that is basics. What do they need? I've been asking some of the psychologists that I trained, and right now they're saying, we need medical supplies right now. That's a very big issue for them. So there's going to be a lot of different need. And as part of our support, we should be able to help with that resource gathering, or at least the networking and making the connections so that all the needs are met. Remember that Maslow's hierarchy. If we don't get the basic needs yet, people are not going to get to the emotional and behavioral health needs, because they do see those as a luxury. So we have to listen and hear what their priorities are. And the Ukrainian people, as I started to say, are incredibly proud of their hard-won democracy. They're also just this unbelievable, they're an incredibly upbeat culture and population. If you know of the history of Ukraine, it's a long history of war and suffering. Many people don't even know the extent to which Ukraine suffered under Stalin, similar to what happened in the Holocaust, and people don't talk about it. And it was around the same, just previous to that time frame. There's a lot of history that says that this is an incredibly traumatized historically culture, but they've come out of this with incredible strength and resilience, and they're not going to let that go so easily. So they are very upbeat. They are looking to the future. They feel like they are going to be able to do what they need to do. And this is also a community, a culture of community. So there is not this sense of independence that we talk about here in the U.S. a lot. Everything is done in community. everything is done in community. Remember that. And as you heard some of our previous speakers, when we enter and speak with folks, even in a refugee placement or a hotel or wherever they are, we do want to reach out to the extended family and make sure that we're approaching those that we're allowed to speak to, or at least together. Otherwise, there can be some uncomfortable feeling about, approaching and talking to children without talking to the parents first, or not involving elders in conversation, or not involving the whole extended family could be seen as problematic. So remember too, this is a culture of community. This is how they function. So just a few pieces that I learned about the Ukrainian culture in working with them, and we certainly hope that whatever else we can do, a compassionate presence is going to be 90% of what we do. And remember that silence and supportive listening are interventions in and of themselves. We know that this can be most helpful. We're in the non-diagnostic mode, as you heard from Dr. Brenner. But also the other important thing to remember is that acute stress responses can happen at any point in the post-event phases. So it's very interesting. We heard a lot of the military on the bases who are working with the Afghan guests say things like, this isn't acute stress. It's been months now. Well, we do know from the research that acute stress responses can happen way down the road after a particular event has occurred, especially when basic needs have not been met. So if people are still not in their homes, they still don't feel safe, they don't have enough food, whatever those basic issues are, if those are not resolved, they're not going to allow themselves to have the emotional response often. So when things get settled, so for example, maybe when they are in a settlement area or are moved to one of the states and are welcomed into a community and can start to feel safe and have food and have shelter, you might see acute stress reactions. And so we stay with that same theme of providing acute and crisis intervention response rather than moving to pathologizing. That doesn't say that there isn't a role, as you heard, for assessing if somebody is in very severe symptomatic state for a longer period of time. But we want to make sure that we have changed the timeline of emergency and disaster response, so it is much more extensive than you saw in the original research from the early days in the 80s when that original disaster and emergency timeline was created. We see acute stress responses can happen. They're delayed and they can happen later on. So we want to stay with our understanding of psychological first aid, compassionate presence, and non-pathologizing. Another issue that we have to be concerned about that we didn't get a chance to talk about as much as we can here, but if you take the psychological first aid training, if you haven't already, it is online, it's free, it comes with 6 CEUs, it gives you a really good sense of psychological first aid. And I can tell you from the last 5 years of training humanitarian aid workers in Europe who are working throughout the African continent and other areas that are impacted, heavily impacted with high numbers of refugees, that the humanitarian aid workers can go through weeks and weeks of training, but they get very little on behavioral health interventions. And when we try to do role playing about how do you approach a refugee, somebody who's just lost their home, some of them have lost family members, they've lost everything, they've lost their sense of who they are and that they can't do the work that they used to do. I ran a hospital at one point, and our head of housekeeping was a man who had been a professor, a highly educated professor in Afghanistan before he left. And the best job that he could get was housekeeping coming here because he did not have the same credentials that he needed to do his same job here. So they might lose a sense of self, the workplace, what they were able to do before. This amount of loss and the grief that comes along with it is tremendous. And if you've not done this before, I highly urge you to role play with your colleagues, with your buddies. Get a sense, how are you going to present yourself? This is not, I'm so-and-so, I'm a psychologist or a therapist, and I want to know how you're feeling. I say that lightly, but it is actually something that people tend to fall back on, especially if they feel nervous and anxious. Think about what you heard in the initial conversation from Dr. Katz is being very practical. Take a walk with me. Do you need some water? Is there something that you need now? Can we talk for a little bit? Let's find a private place. The approach needs to be very soft, very practical, very low key. So if you've not done this before, we highly urge you to do some role playing. And again, if you haven't taken the psychological first aid course, to please do so, so that you get a sense of what practical, compassionate presence is like as compared to formal mental health treatment. So the last part in our wrapping up is that we want to talk about self-care and boundaries. And this is a subject that's near and dear to my heart. I ran the 9/11 mental health response for New York after the towers came down, and did my dissertation on 1,500 of the crisis counselors who responded and worked intensively for 2 years around the city with folks who have been highly affected. We know that people can get affected by secondary traumatic stress, right? This exposure to distress, other people's distress, or even seeing and hearing screams, crying, seeing gore, seeing injuries, and feeling and absorbing the distress. We are all helpers. That's what brings us into this. And this felt sense is going to be there, and it's usually very strong in working with people who are refugees and who are distressed. So for two reasons, you need to be able to take care of yourself, right? But we also need to make sure that you can function in the field. So you heard Dr. Brenner talk about having a buddy in the field. This is going to be very, very important. Somebody that you can share concerns with, but also do some stress management exercises, whether it's walking, doing some running, heavy duty exercises that you're more, used to if you're that type of person, and having a chance to debrief together. Also to check in on whether you are having some responses. So we highly recommend that for people who've had a lot of some trauma in the past year, especially the death of somebody close to you, might not be the best time to be working in these highly intensive, emotionally distressing situations. We also recommend that you do know and feel competent, that you feel trained and confident in doing the work. If it's your first time in the field, you want to make sure that you have a buddy to connect to. But if you have not taken any type of training that allows you to function in the field, in addition to this, then again, we highly recommend, and I see the question is, the psychological first aid course is literally called that. So if you Google online psychological first aid training, it should come up. It is created by the National Child Traumatic Stress Network and the National Center for PTSD. It's free. It's online with 6 CEUs. It's about 6 hours, but you can stop it and start it and go back, and without losing it, you will get your certificate. If you sign up for the CEUs, you'll get it. You do have to register, but you don't have to pay for it. It's very, very helpful. If you can get a live course, such as the one that we're offering next month, that's even better, because we'll be talking and addressing a lot of questions. But this idea of being able to feel competent and confident to do this work in the field is going to be very important, because I do want to say to you that even as highly skilled mental health professionals, there are some people who can get overwhelmed if they've not done this work before, or if they've experienced a recent trauma, or if there is something that you relate to, whether in a countertransference way or in a secondary traumatic stress way, that makes you feel destabilized, anxious, nervous. There have been cases probably in every large disaster when we have deployed large numbers of people into the field over time. I can say that there has been at least one, if not two people, highly trained, from psychiatrists to psychologists to long-standing social workers in the field, where I've been sent in to take people out of the field because they're not able to function properly. The biggest problem is they don't realize that they're not functioning properly. That's why a buddy is important, and responding to the incident commander in the field. So, for example, we might get a call that says somebody's not functioning, they can't remember instructions, they can't follow instructions, they walk around wandering and don't remember where they're supposed to be, or they're not sleeping, or they're up all night and they're wandering around in the field. In almost every case, when I've gone in to bring these people home, they tell me they're fine. I'm fine. I don't understand. I'm fine. So it is something, I think it was Dr. Brenner who referred to it before. When you are highly stressed and the hormones have flooded your body, your cognition changes. And two of the things that are highly researched, that are talked about, are the inability to make good decisions and poor judgment. So if you have a buddy or your supervisor in the field or the incident commander says that you need to take a break, or you need to step out for a while, or you need to end the deployment, you don't argue with them. And again, that's why a buddy is so important, so that you can check with each other, to debrief, to process some of your distress, to get it out of your body by doing some physical movement together, and being able to check yourself. You can avoid some of these things happening by doing things like creating a self-care plan. I think that this course, that the self-care plan, Vibrant Staying in Balance plan, will be available on the site so that people can download it. I highly recommend that you use it. Now, again, this is a topic near and dear to my heart. I learned about this after 9/11 because I myself struggled with so much physical exhaustion from the 3.5 years that the program went on, and suffered with some physical responses to that. But still, I will do a care plan when I go into the field, whether it's, what's the best time that I can take a 10-minute to 20-minute walk every day, or 2 20-minute walks. So when you get in the field and you get a sense of what the timing is, you want to know when it's okay for you to take a walk. You want to identify people that you want to connect with and people that you might not want to connect with. Figure out what other private activities you need to engage in, whether it's calling home, writing a journal, making sure that you have the type of health food that you want. Whatever it is that you need to do to keep yourself in balance is going to be important. So even if you know this information well, and you do have a self-care plan for home, we highly recommend that you use a self-care plan for the field as well. And prepare yourself when you go into the field. You want to make sure that you have things that are comfortable to you. I always bring some pictures of my family from home, and protein bars, and lots of tissues. There's just, I have a list of things. You should be able to do that for yourself and prepare, because the more comfortable you feel, the better you will function in the field. So take a look at what your plan needs to be. Now I know this is tough in the field sometimes to do the things you would normally do, like eating regularly and exercising, but find ways to help yourself to do that. Whenever I land in the field, one of the first things I'll try to do is just find a regular large or small grocery store. I don't care if it's a Walmart or a little tiny grocery store. And I want to be able to go in and have my water, and have my tissues, and have some protein bars or things that I might not have been able to bring with me. Try to set yourself up for the beginning of your field stay. Look at where you can exercise. If I'm a team leader in the field, I will start the day and I will tell my entire team, I'm going to take a 15-minute walk at this time. I encourage everyone to get up and do it with me, and I'll usually do the same at night. Now, some people will join, some people won't, but usually most people will join. It's unusual for people not to. There may be one or two who don't join. But get your body movement in. Body movement moves stress hormones out of your body. Figure out what you need to do to be able to sleep. Sleep will change your life for the good or for the bad. If you're somebody who struggles with sleep issues and you know that may be difficult in the field, bring headphones, bring earplugs, bring an eye mask. I use an old iPod that I have a playlist on and audiobooks that are boring as get out that help me to go to sleep. What do you need to do to help yourself to stay well? Sleep is going to be majorly important when you're in the field. And again, body movement and walking. The other thing that I usually do is have a daily meeting with the whole team so that communications continue to be there. That's going to be very important for any team members. As you heard earlier, Dr. Koifman say, stay in touch with the home base. We always have Amy, who is our home base for our CECT cadre, who checks in on a regular basis. We always prepare for that before people go into the field. Can you go into the next slide, Gonzalo? Thank you. So we will have that download for you to create a self-care plan for yourself. We have lots of recommendations around pre-deployment, meaning how do you ready yourself before you go, checklists and suggestions. We give information about who to contact, who's your lead, and who we know will be the on-site incident commander. These are very important things to know. And I have to tell you, too, that I'm just going to say it plainly. If somebody doesn't follow direction in the field, we will pull them out, and it won't be a request. We've had people who say yes, they'll follow the instruction and they'll communicate with our field instructors, and then they get in the field and they go and do their own thing, and it's just not acceptable because it's not safe and it is not the structure of incident command. And we know that people who tend to try to function on their own and don't communicate with others usually become problematic for the field functioning. They actually get in the way. And that makes things dangerous. And so we will pull people out. So when we say to follow incident command, whoever is in the field and is the incident commander, everybody who's in the field has to respond to the incident commander. You don't argue with them. It's not doing what you want to do, it's doing what you're assigned to do. Mostly behavioral health folks do have a large amount of space to determine who needs to be seen when. It's not usually an issue, but I just want to stress with you, if you are in some areas where there is very restricted movement or restricted space, especially if you're working in a place where refugees are being protected, there may be more militaristic type systems that help keep everyone safe. The other thing is that there may be policies that you don't understand. So let me give you an example. The Afghan guests who were staying on military bases throughout the country the last couple of months are not restricted to staying on their base, right? We don't retain people, we don't hold them back. But they were told that they shouldn't leave the base, and there were a lot of staff who were very concerned about that. Why can't they They should be able to do this, they should be able to do that. Well, the problem is they don't have any papers. So if they wind up in some store and they can't speak the language well enough to be understood and somebody calls for help and somehow police get involved and they have no papers, well, then there's going to be a whole bunch of legal stuff that they don't need to go through. So again, we need to respond to kind of the structures and the policies that are set out in the field because there are a lot of intricacies that we may not know. So you want to make sure that you are responding to being able to care for the refugees that you're working with within the system. And also, it helps you to not get in trouble, to not go beyond your boundaries. Often when we see people who are going beyond boundaries and giving out personal telephone numbers or bringing people in their own cars, they're usually struggling with some kind of internal fear or anxiety, and therefore probably shouldn't be doing the work to begin with. So again, you want to do some self-assessment and check of your own stability and comfort with being able to work within the structure of what it is that the refugees need rather than what we need. And that brings up one of the points that you see. The first point here is you need to join with an organization. Nobody should be going and doing work alone. It's not safe. It's not helpful. There's no way to vet or make sure that individuals who come to a field site or come into an organization to work with folks, if they're not vetted, we don't know who they are. We don't know what the requirements, and mostly we don't know what their training is. So we don't know if they're going to be helpful or not. And we really want people to be helpful. Probably the only complaints, we saw 1.2 million people after 9/11 in mental health responses. And I got a handful of complaints, which was unusual because, normally there's bunches of them. Almost all of those complaints were related to a psychologist or psychiatrist who was trying to diagnose somebody who had an acute stress response and as bipolar or schizophrenic and give them psychiatric medications. So point being to not practice beyond your scope, to stay within your scope and to work with an organization. We have seen people show up on sites, and again, it can be dangerous, that can get in the way. Some of the saddest stories are that people who come in and try and work in the field on their own may cause harm, or they cause harm to themselves. So for example, if something happens to them or something happens to you, if you assign yourself, you find out that there's some place where people are taking in refugees and you show up at an American Red Cross site and you kind of sneak in and or just kind of bypass everybody and don't register and let them know you want to be a formal volunteer. If something happens to you, you're not going to be taken care of. You're going to be on your own. And we don't want to see that happen with any volunteers at all. So these are just lots of small pieces of information to help you to understand that all the information that's offered here today really helps us to function within the structure, within our scope of work, and in a way that can be most effective with the refugees that we may be serving. So do look to join with it, whether it's Red Cross or the Crisis Emotional Care Team. The Crisis Emotional Care Team on the Vibrant website has an application link that you can go into. We will provide information as we can, either in person or virtually, and we're also providing support to refugees both in person and virtually. So do sign up also to get our newsletter so you understand what's going on and what we're involved in. And again, we'll be giving you very specific information. The downloads should be available to you. I think Amy did. I don't know if you put them in the downloads so that people can get resources and the self-care plan. I'm just looking at this note from security is an important issue, very important issue. Yes, I've been working with somebody who's been working in Kabul, been supervising somebody who's been working in Kabul for the past couple of years. Right before the war, she told me that she was being surveyed, and when I had my equipment checked, I had been surveyed too. So security is very important. You want to make sure that you have the right credentials, that you have the right protection, and you work with an agency that's legitimate. I think that I'm going to stop because I think we only have a couple of minutes then for questions and answers, but we wanted to give you as much information as we could about the work that may be coming your way as we start to take in more Ukrainian refugees and help them to settle in with the behavioral health needs that they might need as well. I think I've missed some other questions here, Amy, so I don't know if you or Grant want to jump in and see if there are some questions that we need.
All right, I'm gonna take on the Q&A section, and thank you, April. That was really a wonderful wrap-up, really hitting some of these points that are all seemingly straightforward and seemingly shouldn't be difficult to keep track of. But what we also know from the experience of working in post-disaster areas is that high level of stress makes even simple and common tasks all of a sudden more complex than they have to be. And I see Craig is going to be signing off momentarily. Thank you so much for joining us. It was wonderful to see you, and I know that you're going to remain available to us and folks attending to answer any additional questions. So we'll definitely take on additional questions for Craig if there are specific questions addressed to him. So there are some questions that came in even before the event itself. So we'll talk about some of these in the few remaining. And the first question that is a particularly challenging one, and I was really hoping that Alex will be here to take it on, given his depth and breadth of experience and teaching experience. So I'll do the best I can. And the question is, how can we normalize situation amidst the suffering of war? How can we say any of this is normal? And that's an incredibly complex and difficult question. And I think the thing that comes to mind is not that we will try disingenuously kind of trying to insist that this is normal. None of this is normal. But what I think we want to think about is try to get the point across that it's our reactions and things that we would have done if things were in fact normal are the things that we can't control, even when everything else is outside of our control. So in the worst of circumstances, we can still take a breath, we can still feel the person next to us, we can still form connections to people that we care about, that may be within reach, or think about the loved ones that may be outside of our reach. These are normal functions, normal actions that can be pursued in the most abnormal of circumstances. So calling to ask for the individual, if you are able to, try to do what you can as if things are okay, can be of service to them. It's difficult, but one of the things that we want to also think about is sometimes people would be able to do some of these normal things but feel awfully guilty about doing them because they are the ones who survived out of their family. Giving an individual that permission to be okay even for that short moment, is incredibly important, and that's something that we can do. Another question that came in, how can I get connected to Vibrant to volunteer when the opportunity presents itself? We've been repeatedly listing the Vibrant Crisis and Emotional Care team website in the chat, so please take a look. And I believe Amy and Grant will repeat it again, just so we can make it really easy for folks. But you know what, I'm gonna go ahead and drop it into the chat as well. So we will continue to be available, and we will continue to be available as the situation changes and for other crises. So when you volunteer, we will make it very easy for you to gain access to our resource library, and we'll keep you posted when opportunities present themselves and when you can make full use of your cultural and language skills, as well as your clinical and just ability to engage with people on a humanitarian level work. What are some of the greatest challenges that families of Ukrainian survivors in the US or other countries may face clinically? I was hoping, Grant, if you could take this one. Gonzalo, Amy, if we can.
Okay, got it. I was about to request the mic. Well, the greatest challenges, there are many, and obviously it's going to vary a lot from family to family, person to person. But displacement itself is going to be a great challenge. Separation of families. I've read multiple accounts of families separated. In many cases, also family members who are displaced will have other family members who have remained in Ukraine who are combatants. There also may be family, in Russian territories that can lead to conflict within families, and the acute stress reactions that we've talked about, as well as lack of access to, basic things like food, shelter, and water. Those are all some of the greatest challenges. Um, we can refer back when we share the PDF of the slides to the ones on some of the expected responses in war that the evidence suggests are most common. Um, I think there's more to say, but I think that's a good short answer. Anything you'd add, Sander?
Oh, sorry. I realized that the reason it's quiet is because I'm the one who's supposed to be talking. Sorry, I see some folks are having trouble with some of the languages, so I was trying to track to that. My apologies. And please, sometimes there's a delay before the interpreter starts speaking, so some of it is not necessarily technical. It is just the challenge of presenting simultaneous translation. Will this training be recorded? Yes, it will and is being recorded and will be available on the Vibrance website. How can I connect with Vibrant staff person after this training? The best email to use is gonna be posted in the chat, and it is crisisemotionalcare@vibrant.org. I would appreciate hearing about nuances of providing emergency psychological help via Zoom. So the challenge of doing this work in general, and doing this work via Zoom, via remote tools in particular, is just being present. And I would like to really call attention to this a little bit more. Oftentimes we focus on the technical aspect, we focus on the comfort of the environment. Is it the right room? Is it the right chair? Are there the right resources? Is there, all of these comforts that we focus on? But I would venture to say that the most important thing is mental and emotional presence. And that comes through no matter what resource you use. The presence in your tone of voice, the presence in your posture, the presence, even when you have technical difficulties, can still be communicated through reassuring the person that no matter what may be happening, you will do the best you can to stay in touch or get in touch when you are able to do so. It's also important to set up realistic expectations and reassure the person that these are these additional ways of getting in touch with additional help. And this part is important because it requires preparedness and preparation on your end. So knowing what additional resources may be used to provide for additional services and comfort for the individual is absolutely critical, especially when everything else is disrupted. So thinking ahead of time, knowing what to do if you are not available and where the individual can come for help or connect for additional help, even remotely, is a good way to think about. I'm in attendance to classes for our local crisis volunteer team, and one of the police officers doing the training called out saying that this whole training is simply understanding what resources exist in the preparation. It's not about mechanical skills, how to put out the fire or how to pull the water hose. It is all about preparedness. It is all about understanding of what your role is going to be and whom you can hand off for additional resources if you're not available. So I think keeping that framework in mind, Zoom is not going to be a whole lot different than anything else. Focus on presence, focus on preparedness, and utilize the best resources possible. The one interesting opportunity to consider is that sometimes virtual presence is a little less threatening than in-person presence. So it can make it easier for the individual to actually engage with you in the conversation. April, I don't know if you wanted to say any additional, if there are any additional notes. We're at 152. I would love for people to have the opportunity to simply take a breath and stay centered and take care of themselves for any additional time. So I don't feel compelled to continue talking just for the sake of filling the time. So I don't know if you want to take over the mic.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that, Sander, especially since I talk really fast, and I know that I do. And I appreciate that we need to take a breath. And I didn't get to do stretching with you because I got called for a couple of minutes into another meeting. But I sit at my desk all day long, and I don't know about you, but doing these stretches that while you're at your desk, they're just so good for us, forward and back. Remember, stress is about all the hormones that build up in your body as well as your perception. We are very privileged to be able to do this work, but we are also very cautious, knowing that we must always learn what is the best way to enter and engage with different cultures. We are welcoming of folks who might want to join with us at the Crisis Emotional Care Team. We're very, very fortunate that we have a lot of support from a number of partners to be able to do this work. And look for the specifics that you see. We do cover the logistics for people to get someplace and to be able to engage for however long. We've had people go for a few days to a few weeks to folks that have been deployed for a few months someplace. It is very good work to do. I often get the question posed to us is how do we continue to do this work and still feel a sense of compassion satisfaction rather than getting tired out or burned out or have secondary traumatic stress or compassion fatigue. And our outlook here at Vibrant is that this is absolutely a sacred place to be in a manner of words. People allow us to come in and help them at their most vulnerable time. So we are gentle and caring with them, and we're hoping that we can give them the kind of support and the hope that they need to continue on a recovery path. And so we'd be privileged for any of you who would want to join us, and hope that you will take a look at our website to be able to see if you're interested in working with Crisis Emotional Care Team. And again, thank you for taking the time today. I think there's going to be a lot more information coming out in our newsletter as we move forward. My understanding at this point is that we are not going to have a formal federal response, mental health response to Ukrainians' needs for supports for refugees here, but there are going to be lots of different ways to provide that support, and we'll be trying to share that information as we become aware of it. Each of our guests bring an incredible amount of expertise. We hope that you will be able to have any of the questions that you want addressed. If you reach out to the CECT, our program director, Amy Dominguez, will be able to respond and connect you with any other specific questions that you might have to be able to connect you up with the resources to be able to answer them. Amy's our lead and doing an extraordinary job and put all of this together for us today. So thank you, Amy, and the rest of the team for taking your time. I hope we can all give our best thoughts and wishes to Alex. Obviously, he had some internet issues. We know that he's safe at this time, but we'll continue to check in and see how we can support him and his efforts in providing behavioral health care to his colleagues and community members there in the western area of Ukraine. Are there last questions that we have missed? Oh, thank you for your lovely words and for joining us again today. And we hope to have opportunity to meet with all of you again at some point in the future. Amy, did you want to say anything last?
Everybody for joining us today. We posted the appropriate links and emails in the chat. Feel free to join, connect with us that way as well. Again, it's crisis emotional care at vibrant.org, and we'll be in touch with you. Thank you, everybody. We will be sending out the link and the slides shortly once we receive that link. Thank you so much, and have a fantastic rest of your day. Be well.